second speaker will be Hannah Gosnell, who's an associate professor in geography in the College of Earth, Ocean, and Atmospheric Sciences, and she'll explain, give us some background historically in terms of why this land has become contested territory, why there are conflicts over this.
Well, thank you for bringing the birds into the conversation, Charles. It's a really interesting piece of the history, I think. This image here I just came across last night. These bird hats were quite popular in Europe and the US in the 1800s, and to accommodate these wealthy ladies, these plume hunters traveled throughout our region and just decimated the bird population.
Could you speak up a little, please?
Yeah. So anyway, a moment of gratitude for the forward-thinking people in the late 1800s and early 1900s who saw the need to set aside some of these lands to protect some of these precious resources of ours. People like Roosevelt and Finland. So Malheur National Wildlife Refuge was originally set aside for these to protect the birds from the plume hunters. And today it has it serves many other kinds of ecosystem services, if you will. The provisioning services, food and fiber production, anglers and hunters can come there and hunt for low cost compared to what they'd have to pay on private lands. Birders come, recreationists come. A big part of the local economy comes from local tourism, from birders, about $15 million a year into the local economy from refuge-related tourism. And I'll admit my bias up front. I really think that our federal land system is a great thing, and I feel like we're really lucky. It's really a unique system in the world to have such a huge, expansive federally managed lands that the public has access to. Coming from the east, where it's all private land, that's what drew me out here out west, is the public lands, and spending time on the public lands really shaped my career and led me into the career of geography and trying to understand how humans relate to the environment. So I have a soft spot in my heart for these public lands, and I would hate to see them go away. Although I think it's interesting to hear the conversations get brought up periodically throughout history. So I thought what I would do is just do a little overview of public lands history. I have a few minutes here, but in general, when public lands historians talk about our public land system and the history, they talk about three eras: the eras of acquisition, disposal, and retention. And each of these eras represents kind of a new way of thinking about how we as Americans want to manage our lands. And during the era of acquisition was right after the Revolution, and the original colonies ceded all their western lands to the central government. And that was the beginning. And then through treaties and purchases, Louisiana Purchase, and treaties with indigenous tribes, the federal government amassed over 1 billion acres of land throughout the 1800s. And then the policy soon became, well, let's give it away to private landowners. The Jeffersonian ideal, let's incentivize people to go out and homestead and settle these communities and develop the water systems and make it inhabitable and farm and cut down trees and build houses. And there were a lot of federal programs meant to incentivize that kind of development all throughout the 1800s. The Homestead Acts, the railroad grants, the Desert Lands Act, all different kinds of homestead acts that were there. And Charles Wilkinson talks, a historic or public law professor, Charles Wilkinson talks about this era as like the Great Barbecue, because it was just a big giveaway, and a lot of incredibly valuable resources were given away for a very small amount of money. And so the people that were there at the time really benefited, and they still today, their families still continue to benefit from that time period. But during that time, there was growing concerns about overexploitation, as you can imagine, and think about the grazing lands throughout the 1920s and 30s, the Dust Bowl, the drought, and incredible overgrazing problems. And eventually, the federal government decided to kind of change its policy and end this disposal era and move more towards retention. And so the Taylor Grazing Act, passed in 1934, was really the beginning of the end of this disposal era and the beginning of the retention era. And that was where the government established the U.S. Grazing Service and started to have more rules and regulations around grazing, instead of just having to be sort of a free-for-all for private ranchers. And this is, of course, the other parts of the retention era would be establishing Yosemite National Park, Yellowstone in 1872, Yosemite in 1890, And then the forests, although the U.S. Forest Service was set up in the late 1800s by Gifford Pinchot and Teddy Roosevelt. And so this is like the beginning of this new paradigm, and the wildlife refuge being set up as part of that, the beginning of that retention era. And we're still in the retention era now, and it's still a bit of a sore spot for people that really liked the disposal era, and wish that time came, that time continued. So the official end of the disposal era came with the Federal Land Policy Management Act, FLPMA, in 1976. And that's what established BLM, the Bureau of Land Management. That's where we are today with our grazing lands. It's the agency that manages most of our grazing lands, along with the Forest Service. So just a little bit about our basic, you can see here the West is just dominated by public land, so it's no surprise that when we have these uprisings and these rebellions, they happen in the West. About half of the West is public land, and it varies by state. Some states are much more than that. And you can see the different colors here. The yellow is Bureau of Land Management. By far, that's the largest portion of public land is BLM land. The green is Forest Service. The brown are Indian reservations. And the pink are a few parks here and there. You can see Yellowstone there, and Crater Lake and so on. But the BLM is by far the largest land manager in the United States, and very controversial because it's mostly grazing land. A lot of people feel like it's worthless land and it shouldn't have been set aside and it shouldn't be subjected to so many environmental regulations. So today the BLM manages about 258 million acres, about 40% of all federal land is BLM land, and it's about 11% of all U.S. land. And it's administered for multiple uses: recreation, grazing, timber harvesting, mining, watershed protection, wildlife and fish habitat. And a lot of what the BLM is used for is for ranchers grazing their cattle. So they issue about 21,000 allotments, 18,000 permits and leases, and each of those permits is generally 10 years and it's renewable. And then along with that is a grazing fee, usually about $1.35 per animal unit month, which is much cheaper than it would cost if you were going to graze your animals on private leased land, more like $8 per AUM, or maybe even more, sometimes up to $20 if it's really nice land. So that's the main use of the BLM lands these days. And also home to a lot of endangered species and other ecosystem services and environmental values too. Sage-grouse habitat, Paiute homeland, artifacts. So, and then just to give you a sense of Oregon here, you can see the southeast corner of Oregon is mostly BLM. Of course, we have all our Forest Service and the Cascades and the Coast Range. But you can see this area that's kind of right in the middle of all the controversy right now is just right in the middle of all the BLM grazing land. So that's what's at stake. The people that are there now would like to see that land returned to locals. Well, returned is an interesting word. We'll get to that in a second. So this map gives you an idea of why maybe some of this resentment has been bubbling up again and again throughout history. You can see that in some places like Nevada, almost 85% of the land in Nevada is federally controlled. So if you live in Nevada, the government feels much more oppressive to you than if you, say, live in Texas or Oklahoma or even back east. So this is where that resentment, I think, it's not surprising a lot of it bubbles up in these states that have such high percentages of public land. And throughout time, we've had these sagebrush rebellions. This is nothing new. The first real big significant sagebrush rebellion was in the 1940s, where the Forest Service reduced livestock numbers after World War II, and a bunch of ranchers in Utah got together and said, if we don't like this, we want you to return we want you to give the BLM lands to the states, and the states should then sell them to the private landowners. And then in the 70s, as a response to the FLPMA, not to the Federal Land Policy Management Act, the sagebrush rebels said, well, we want to pass legislation that will let us return the land to the states, return federal land to the states. But the reason that wasn't successful is because it was considered unconstitutional, because when the states went from territories to statehood, they agreed to disclaim forever all right and title to the unappropriated public lands lying within said territory, and that the same shall be and remain at the sole and entire disposition of the U.S. So the federal lands were never owned or controlled or managed by the states. And so that's sort of this misconception that the people there now keep saying that they want to have the land given back. It never was. It was always federal land. And so And then over time, throughout the 1990s, the Wise Youth Movement brought this issue up again. Last year with Cleveland Bundy in Nevada, this issue came up again where he got a lot of attention for being having a standoff with the Bureau of Land Management, tried to get him to pay his grazing fees, which he had owed for 20 years. He owed over $1 million. He didn't want to pay them. He refused to pay them. BLM came to go round up the cattle, and his friends and people from all over the country came to defend him. And the BLM, because they're armed, the people who came were armed, backed off. And so Cleveland Bundy still hasn't paid his grazing fees, and he's still grazing. And the BLM just stepped away. So Cleveland Bundy's son, Eamon, since then had been looking around for something, another cause to kind of rally around. And so, these are so in the 80s, Ronald Reagan counted himself as a sagebrush rebel too. He was running for president and came out and rallied a lot of people there. And then this is another news article about Utah trying to annex federal lands and turn them into state lands. In the Bundy case here in Gosnell, Nevada. So they had armed people, and the BLM was intimidated and backed off. So now you've got the Malheur case where the extremes with getting rid of all the cattle or giving all the lands to the ranchers, but in this radical center, a neutral place where people explore their interests instead of arguing their positions. And so, sorry, keep going. So this, I would say, since the early 2000s has really been the dominant paradigm in range management in the West, and much more so than the radical stuff that you're seeing today. There's rancher collaboratives that have popped up all over the West. There's this latest book that just came out by Susan Charnley, and some OSU authors are in this book here, Stitching the West Back Together, talking about how people are coming together and finding common ground and coming up with solutions. Federal agency people and ranchers and environmentalists. And so just as an example, one of these rancher collaboratives is right there in Harney County, the High Desert Partnership, and they're all about collaboration, and they've made lots of progress with bringing together formerly angry ranchers with federal agency, whether it's the Wildlife Refuge or the local BLM, and they've come up with agreements on how to manage sage-grouse habitat without the Endangered Species Act. These candidate conservation agreement with assurances, a big accomplishment. They've worked the ranchers and Fish and Wildlife Service work together to create a plan for the wildlife refuge too that brought in the ranchers' concerns. And so you can just see that their overall goal is definitely about collaboration and having sustainable rural communities and economies, but also having ecological sustainability too. And so anyway, I just thought I'd end with this idea. This is from Courtney White's book. He opens his book, Revolution on the Range, with this quote by Rumi, which I think was an interesting opening for a book about ranching. But really, I think that this sums up that that's probably the best way forward, is just a more collaborative approach in the radical center. And it's happening there in Harney County, but we're not seeing as much press about that part of the story. We're hearing more about the conflict. Which this, I think, is by far much more interesting and exciting. So I hope we'll keep an eye out more for this and see more of this in the future. Sorry, everyone.